So, it all started one bright Saturday afternoon, and I was just standing on my front lawn, watching my twins, Emma and Jake, wobble down the sidewalk on their little bikes, training wheels finally off, faces lit up with that mix of fear and pride you get when a kid first feels the wind on their cheeks without holding on to anything. And I was smiling at them, thinking this is exactly what childhood is supposed to feel like. When I saw him, Mr. Franklin, coming across the street with that clipboard like he owned the place, scowl permanently etched on his face, and I swear, the way he walked, it was like he was marching into battle, clipboard first, like a general or something, and before I could even say hi, he barks, and quote, "Excuse me, but recreational cycling is not permitted on community walkways," and quote. And I froze, my brain trying to catch up with my mouth, which wanted to laugh because I thought maybe I misheard. But nope, Emma had stopped pedaling mid-street. Jake was staring, and the scowl only deepened. And then he whips out this laminated sheet like it's a sword and reads it like a scripture. HOA Regulation 22B, and quote, "Sidewalks are for pedestrian traffic only. Bicycles create liability issues and potential damage to our concrete surfaces," and quote. And I'm standing there thinking, these are 8-year-olds. They're wobbling, learning balance, not breaking the laws of physics. And yet here we are. Suddenly the kids are criminals for riding a bike on a sidewalk they didn't even build. I asked, and quote, "Wait, so they can't ride here at all?" And quote. And he nods solemnly, like I'm about to be the next headline in some HOA newsletter, and quote. "No bikes allowed. Ever, anywhere," and quote. And my mind immediately goes to the nearest park, which is like 2 miles away, uphill, past 3 stop signs, and I remember thinking, you have to be kidding me. I mean, it's not like I was letting them ride down a freeway. It's a quiet residential street with minimal foot traffic, and yet here's Franklin, reading the rules like he's reciting the 10 Commandments. All the while my twins are standing there, confused, staring at me like, "Dad, why is this man ruining our fun?" And that's when I realized, this isn't about the bikes. It's about power. It's about control. It's about a little man with a clipboard feeling important in a neighborhood that didn't even elect him to be some kind of judge of childhood. He goes on, and quote, "We've had complaints about tire marks, potential accidents. The board voted unanimously. No bicycles on walkways," and quote. And I watched the color drain from Emma's face and Jake's little shoulders slump, and it hits me right in the chest, because I remember that exact moment when I first rode my bike without training wheels, and it felt like freedom. And now my kids are getting robbed of it before they even know what independence feels like. I wanted to argue, wanted to yell, wanted to shake him, but instead I just smiled and said, and quote, "All right," and quote, because arguing never works with these people. Their rules first, community second, and I had a feeling that this was one of those fights where the HOA always wins, at least in the short term. So, I went inside that night, made dinner, tried to act normal while Emma and Jake sulked about their ruined afternoon, and then it hit me. The tiniest detail that Franklin had conveniently left out of his little speech. 3 years ago, when the neighborhood upgraded to those fancy new LED streetlights, someone had to put the transformer and the control box somewhere central so maintenance crews could reach it without wandering the entire neighborhood. And guess where that was? My backyard shed. I had let them install it for free, thinking, hey, this will make the neighborhood safer, a little goodwill gesture, maybe get some neighborly smiles in return. But apparently, around here, goodwill is a one-way street, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt that low simmer of irritation in my chest, the kind that starts as a quiet pulse and grows louder with every complaint about concrete or, in quote, liability, in quote, or tire marks, and I started thinking about Franklin again, the way he strutted across my lawn, like he was king of the sidewalks. And I had an idea, a very, very good idea, and maybe a little crazy, but it was satisfying just thinking about it. I went out back, looked at that little metal box in the corner of my shed, the label reading, in quote, "Community Lighting System," and quote. And I swear for a second I felt like a villain in one of those thrillers where the guy in the garage holds the world in his hands, because that one switch controlled every single street light in the development, and the thought flickered through my brain, dark, delicious, simple, just flip it, just one flick, and suddenly no one's marching, no one's complaining. Everyone's in the dark, literally, for a taste of what it feels like to have your own rules ignored, and it was perfect. And so, the next evening, after tucking the kids into bed, I went back out, heart racing, a little laugh bubbling up because it felt ridiculous and cinematic at the same time, and I flipped the breaker. And in that moment, silence took over the streets, complete, almost holy, except for the occasional dog bark and the distant honk of a confused driver. I stood there in the quiet darkness for a second, just breathing it in, thinking, well, this is it, the start of a very interesting week. The first night was almost peaceful. I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee long after sunset, watching the neighborhood adjust to something it hadn't and Appos T experienced in years, actual darkness. It wasn't Appos T pitch black. Porch lights glowed here and there, a few garage lights clicked on, and moonlight spilled across the rooftops. But the neat little rows of HOA-approved LED streetlights that everyone took for granted were gone, and suddenly people noticed. By the next morning, the neighborhood Facebook group was already melting down. Somebody posted that the lights must have been damaged by a storm. Another person blamed the power company. A retired engineer down the street insisted it was a software failure because, end quote, modern systems are too complicated, end quote. I just sat there eating cereal and reading the comments. Frankly, it was the most entertaining thing I and Appos D seen all year. That afternoon, Emma and Jake were practicing bike turns in our driveway when I noticed curtains moving all over the neighborhood. People were looking around, trying to figure out what was happening, trying to find someone to blame. And that and Appos S the thing about communities like ours. When everything works, nobody notices. But the second something stops working, everybody suddenly becomes an expert. Day 2 brought the first real complaints. Mrs. Peterson from 3 houses down twisted her ankle while walking her golden retriever after dark. Nothing serious, but serious enough to generate 27 comments online and 3 angry emails to the HOA. Then came the delivery drivers. Without the streetlights illuminating house numbers, packages started showing up at the wrong homes. A guy delivering pizza accidentally left 6 large pepperonis at a family that had ordered Chinese food. One teenager spent 40 minutes wandering around trying to find the right address for a graduation party. People were getting irritated, and irritation was slowly turning into anger. The HOA board, meanwhile, was scrambling. I knew because my next-door neighbor, Carl, happened to serve on one of the community committees, and Carl loved gossip almost as much as breathing. He stopped by my driveway one evening while the twins practiced writing. End quote. Board meeting lasted 3 hours last night, end quote, he said. I laughed. End quote. Over streetlights, end quote. End quote. Over streetlights, end quote. End quote. What and Appos D they decide, end quote. He grinned. End quote. They and Appos V got no clue, end quote. That made me smile more than it probably should have. The truth is, Franklin hadn't and Appos T always been this way. Years earlier, before he became HOA treasurer, he was actually a decent guy. Friendly, approachable, the kind of neighbor who and Appos D help you move a couch. Then he got elected, and somehow that tiny little taste of authority changed him. Every year he got stricter. Every year the rules got more ridiculous. First it was mailbox colors, then lawn heights, then holiday decorations. One family got fined because their Christmas lights stayed up 3 days too long. Another got cited because their basketball hoop was visible from the street. It became less about maintaining property values and more about maintaining control. And people knew it. They just didn't and Appos T know how to push back. Most homeowners paid the fines, signed the forms, followed the rules, because fighting the HOA felt exhausting. I understood that. I and Appos D done the same thing for years, until he decided my kids riding bicycles was somehow a threat to civilization. By day 3, Franklin finally called me. I was in my garage helping Jake adjust his bike seat when my phone rang. His name popped up on the screen. I almost laughed before answering. End quote. Hello, end quote. His voice sounded stressed. More stressed than I and Appos D ever heard. End quote. Hey, Ethan, quick question, end quote. End quote. Sure, end quote. End quote. The utility company says the neighborhood lighting system has been disconnected somehow, end quote. I pretended to think about it. End quote. Huh, end quote. End quote. Yeah, end quote. A long pause. Then he asked, end quote. You Haven and Appos T noticed anything unusual around the equipment in your shed, have you? End quote. There it was. The first probe. The first little fishing expedition. I looked over at my toolbox and smiled. End quote. Nope. Everything seems normal, end quote. Another pause, end quote. Okay, end quote. Then he hung up. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. Not enough evidence. Not enough certainty. Just suspicion. The next few days got increasingly chaotic. Without streetlights, people started changing their routines. Dog walkers carried flashlights. Joggers moved their runs earlier. Parents waited outside for teenagers coming home after dark. A neighborhood that normally felt predictable suddenly felt uncertain. Not dangerous, just inconvenient. And inconvenience is something people tolerate for about 5 minutes before demanding solutions. Day 5 brought the first accident. A man backing out of his driveway clipped his own mailbox. Again, nobody got hurt. But facts dawn and oppose. Matter much once frustration takes over. The story spread through the community like wildfire. By evening, people were acting like the neighborhood had become a war zone. The HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting. Attendance broke records. And according to Carl, Franklin spent most of that meeting getting verbally destroyed. Residents wanted answers. They wanted timelines. They wanted accountability. The irony was beautiful. For years, he and Oppos demanded accountability from everyone else. Now hundreds of homeowners wanted it from him. Then came day 7. And day 7 was when things got interesting. A contractor finally traced the issue. Not completely, but close enough. Around lunchtime, a white work truck pulled into my driveway. A guy wearing an electrical company uniform stepped out carrying a clipboard. Different clipboard. Much friendlier face. He knocked on my door. I opened it. End quote. Mr. Parker? End quote. End quote. That and Oppos. S me? End quote. He smiled politely. End quote. We and Oppos. VE been hired by the HOA to inspect the lighting control system located on your property. End quote. I nodded. End quote. Okay. End quote. End quote. We and Oppos. Like access to the equipment. End quote. And there it was. The moment I and Oppos been waiting for. Now, here and Oppos. As something most people don and Oppos know. The equipment technically sat on my property. The HOA had permission to use the space. But that permission agreement was old, vague, and surprisingly incomplete. No guaranteed access language. No emergency override clause. No specific maintenance provisions. Just a simple document from years ago when everyone trusted everyone. Back before Franklin turned the HOA into a neighborhood dictatorship. So I crossed my arms and looked thoughtful. End quote. That equipment contains high-voltage components, right? End quote. The contractor blinked. End quote. Technically, yes. End quote. End quote. End quote. I nodded slowly. End quote. I and Oppos am concerned about liability. End quote. His face changed immediately. Because contractors understand those magic words. Liability. Safety. Insurance. Inspection. Those words stop conversations fast. End quote. I and Oppos really prefer to see current inspection permits before allowing anyone access. End quote. He sighed. End quote. I don and Oppos have those. End quote. End quote. Then I and Oppos am afraid I can and Oppos authorize entry. End quote. He looked frustrated but not surprised. End quote. How long would permits take? End quote. I shrugged. End quote. Hard to say. End quote. And honestly, that wasn't Oppos even a lie. City offices were notoriously slow. A week, 2 weeks, maybe longer. The contractor stood there for a moment. Then he nodded. End quote. Understood. End quote. And drove away. That evening, Carl practically sprinted across the street to tell me what happened next. End quote. The board is losing their minds. End quote. I laughed. End quote. That bad. End quote. End quote. Worse. End quote. Apparently, Franklin spent nearly an hour arguing with lawyers. The lawyers explained something very simple. The HOA couldn't and Oppos force immediate access. Not without a court order. Not without a process. And definitely not overnight. For the first time since this whole thing started, Franklin had run into something he couldn't and Oppos bully, fine, or regulate away. And that and Oppos when the pressure really started building. Because every single day the lights stayed off, more residents got angry. More complaints arrived. More questions were asked. And eventually all roads led back to one person. Franklin. By the end of the second week, the neighborhood wasn't Oppos talking about streetlights anymore. They were talking about him. They were talking about the bicycle ban. They were talking about years of ridiculous rules. They were talking about how a community designed for families somehow ended up treating children like a nuisance. And for the first time in a very long time, people were starting to realize something. Maybe the problem had never been the bikes. Maybe the problem was the people making the rules. And one afternoon, as Emma and Jake rode circles around the driveway laughing harder than they had in days, I looked up and saw something that immediately told me the game was about to change. Franklin was walking toward my house. But this time he wasn't Apos, T alone. Behind him were 4 other HOA board members. Nobody was carrying a clipboard. Nobody looked confident. And judging by the expressions on their faces, they hadn't Apos, T come to give orders. They and Apos, D come to negotiate. The second I saw them walking up my driveway, I knew exactly why they were there. You could tell from the way they moved. 2 weeks earlier, Franklin had marched across my lawn like a man enforcing the law of the land. Now he looked like somebody heading into a job interview he wasn't Apos, T going to get. The board members behind him wearing Apos, T much better. Tired faces. Forced smiles. The kind of body language people have when they and Apos, VE spent 14 straight days getting yelled at by angry homeowners. Meanwhile, Emma and Jake were riding circles around the driveway, laughing so hard they nearly crashed into each other. The timing couldn't and Apos, T have been more perfect. I stepped out from the garage and wiped my hands on an old shop towel. End quote. Afternoon, end quote. Nobody answered immediately. Franklin glanced at the kids, then at me, then back at the kids, almost like he was finally seeing them for the first time. Not as a rule violation, not as a liability, just kids. The board president, a woman named Diane, finally stepped forward. End quote. Ethan, do you have a few minutes to talk? End quote. I smiled. End quote. Sure, end quote. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Franklin cleared his throat. And what came out next nearly made me laugh. End quote. I think we may have been too strict regarding the bicycle policy. End quote. May have been. Not were. May have been. Even now the man was fighting for every inch of pride he had left. I nodded. End quote. Go on, end quote. Diane opened a folder she was carrying. End quote. The board voted this morning to permanently repeal Regulation 22B. End quote. I looked at her. She continued. End quote. Children will now be allowed to ride bicycles, scooters, and similar recreational equipment on all community sidewalks. End quote. Behind me I heard Jake whisper, end quote. Wait, really? End quote. Emma and Apos, SI's got huge. I didn't and Apos, T say anything. I just let Diane keep talking. End quote. We and Apos, LL also be installing several children at play signs throughout the neighborhood. End quote. Another board member stepped forward. End quote. We and Apos, recreating designated family recreation guidelines instead of restrictions. End quote. I almost admired how carefully they were wording everything. Nobody wanted to say surrender. Nobody wanted to say mistake. But everybody standing there knew exactly what this was. A surrender. A very expensive one. Then came my favorite part. Diane glanced toward Franklin before speaking again. End quote. We and Apos, VE also reviewed the original equipment agreement concerning the community lighting system. End quote. Now we were getting somewhere. She handed me another document. End quote. The board would like to establish a formal lease arrangement for the equipment space in your shed. End quote. I looked down at the paperwork. Monthly compensation. Guaranteed access procedures. Liability protection. Maintenance requirements. Everything that should have existed years ago. End quote. What and Apos? S the lease amount. End quote. I asked. Diane hesitated. Franklin looked like he was chewing nails. End quote. $150 per month. End quote. For a second I thought I misheard. Not because it was a huge amount of money. Because 2 weeks earlier they had been using the space completely free. Now they were offering to pay me every month just to end the nightmare. I slowly folded the papers. Looked at Franklin. And for the first time since this whole thing started, he met my eyes without any arrogance. Without any authority. Without any lectures. Just exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from losing a fight you never expected to fight in the first place. End quote. You know, end quote. I said quietly, end quote. When you came over about the bikes, you could and Apos. He just talked to me. End quote. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. End quote. You could and Apos. VE said there were concerns. End quote. End quote. You could and Apos. VE asked for compromise, end quote. End quote. You could and oppose. VE worked with us, end quote. I glanced at Emma and Jake, end quote. They and oppose. Re 8 years old, end quote. Franklin looked down. For once he had nothing to say. And honestly, that was probably the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get. So I nodded. End quote. Deal, end quote. The relief was immediate. You could actually see it wash across their faces, like somebody had just announced the end of a natural disaster. Hands were shaken. Papers were signed. And 20 minutes later, the board members climbed back into their cars and drove away. Franklin was the last one to leave. Before getting into his car, he stopped, turned around, and looked at me. For a moment, I thought he was about to defend himself, or justify everything, or maybe start another argument. Instead, he simply said, end quote, the kids ride pretty well, end quote. Then he got in his car and drove away. I stood there for a second, honestly surprised, because after everything that happened, that might have been the most human thing he and Oppos D said all year. That evening, just before sunset, I walked out to the shed. The neighborhood was quiet. The air was cool, and somewhere in the distance I could hear kids playing basketball. I opened the metal panel, looked at the familiar breaker, the same one that had accidentally become the most powerful object in the entire community, and I laughed. Because if somebody had told me a month earlier that a bicycle argument would end with an HOA paying me rent and rewriting its policies, I wouldn't oppose. VE thought they were insane. I wrapped my hand around the switch, paused for a second, then pushed it up. One click. That and oppose. That's all it took. A moment later, streetlights began coming back to life. One block, then another, then another. Rows of warm white lights stretched across the neighborhood like a wave. Driveways glowed. Sidewalks brightened. Intersections lit up. And somewhere nearby, I heard somebody cheer. No joke. An actual cheer. I stood there smiling while the entire community slowly illuminated around. And for the first time in 2 weeks, everything felt normal again. The next morning, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee. Emma and Jake rode up and down the sidewalk, back and forth, laughing, competing, being kids. Nobody stopped them. Nobody complained. Nobody waved a rule book around. A few neighbors even smiled and waved as they passed. And honestly, that was the whole point. It was never about winning. It was never about revenge. It was about reminding people what neighborhoods are supposed to be. Places where families live. Places where kids grow up. Places where common sense matters more than power trips. Now, was I petty? Absolutely. I and Oppos, LL admit that. Was turning off the lights a little extreme? Maybe. Okay, probably. But after years of watching people get pushed around by rules that made no sense, part of me thinks somebody had to remind the board that communities aren't and Oppos, T built by regulations. They and Oppos, rebuilt by people. And sometimes people push back. So now I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have accepted the bicycle ban and found somewhere else for the kids to ride? Would you have gone through lawyers and endless HOA meetings? Or would you have flipped that breaker and let the entire neighborhood discover exactly how much power one frustrated parent can have? Let me know down in the comments. And be honest, because something tells me this story is going to divide people right down the middle.